Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jen Eckerly. I'm the Deputy Secretary for Oceans and Coastal Policy for the California Natural Resources Agency and the Executive Director of the Ocean Protection Council. I want to welcome you all to this webinar today, where we'll be presenting our draft State of California Sea Level Rise Guidance. This is the 2024 Science and Policy Update. This guidance was released on January 19th for public comment, and this is the first and primary webinar meant to provide a broad overview of the science and policy content. There will also be a series of regional workshops that will provide additional opportunity to engage and provide feedback, particularly on the regional application. This is the fourth update since OPC released its first guidance back in 2010. The original and continuing purpose of this guidance is to support state and local action to assess vulnerability to rising seas and climate-driven flooding, and the creation of adaptation plans and projects that build resilience into the future. This document was last updated in 2017 and 18, and the Ocean Protection Council has committed to updating it every 5 years in order to stay current with the most recent science. In the last iteration, the science and the policy reports were separate. Since then, there have been significant advancements in scientific understanding and the ability to project future sea level rise, which is captured in this update. And this guidance, you'll see, includes both the science and the policy reports packaged together. And so with that, thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm going to pass it over now to Dom Kone, the Senior Science Officer at the Ocean Science Trust.
Thanks so much, Jen. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Dominic Kone, and I'm a Senior Science Officer with the California Ocean Science Trust. We are an independent nonprofit that was created by the state to deliver science guidance to help inform state policy decisions with best available science, while also simultaneously advancing statewide goals and priorities on our ocean and coast. Since August 2022, we were very fortunate to have partnered with OPC to bring together some of the leading scientific experts on sea level rise, coastal hazards and processes, and planning to co-develop this guidance update. As you'll see in the guidance and hear from our presenters today, the guidance includes 2 core science sections that include our current updated understanding of future sea level rise, as well as nearshore coastal hazards like flooding. And those were developed primarily by the scientists on the task force. The third section is the policy guidance, which was developed by OPC and provides actionable recommendations for using this new science across the diversity of decisions and planning activities across the state. Therefore, for the first time, this guidance includes both the science and policy together in such a way that uses science as a guide to evaluate potential policy actions that are both rooted in science, but are also flexible and responsive to the diversity of decisions, activities, and needs for planning. So today, we'll first hear from some of the lead authors on each of those core components of the guidance, and then we'll jump into a Q&A discussion with the presenters to answer some of your questions. The Q&A is going to take place directly after the presentation, but please do submit any of your questions at any time through the Q&A feature as they come up. And we'll be sure to address as many as we possibly can during the panel discussion. So without further ado, I'm happy to pass things over and introduce our first presenter, who is Dr. Ben Hamilton, who comes from NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and he is going to present and discuss the updates on the sea level rise scenarios. So over to you, Ben.
Thank you very much, Dom. Let me share my screen real quick here and get going. All right, thanks. So as Dom said, I'm going to be covering the science update, which is section 2 of this report. So as Dom said, the last time around, these were 2 separate reports, the science update followed by the guidance update. Here, we're attaching the 2 together. And I want to cover today the changes from the 2017 report and what we're providing here and how we're supporting the generation of guidance on top of the latest science. So just to start things off, what's included in section 2 of this report? So there's 5 sea level scenarios. I'll talk about what a sea level scenario is in just a minute, covering the time period from 2020 to 2150. And these are intended to span the plausible range of sea level rise. And we're localizing those down to California. So even though we're generating these scenarios on global scales, we're actually providing them here specifically in California. These are available statewide, so across the entirety of the state coastlines, but also at 13 specific tide gauges here in California. So what's new in this report? The first thing that's new is that we're leveraging updated science. So the biggest update came from the IPCC 6th assessment report. So that came out in 2021. It was really the foundation of the science that we're providing within this section. On top of that, there was the federal technical report. So the Sweet et al. 2022, I was one of the lead authors in that report, but we took the context from the IPCC and started to generate what we call sea level scenarios. So trying to transition from the wide range of possibilities that are conveyed within the IPCC assessments, and then putting them to a form that is more understandable and easier to plan for the future. So within this report, we also do a couple additional things that are beyond what was done in that federal technical report. We evaluate the most likely scenario. I'll talk about what that means in just a minute. So going beyond just presenting the scenarios as they are, but also talking about which of these are most likely for the coastlines of California as we go forward. We also rely on our observations. So we have good tide gauge and satellite observations of sea level along the California coast. We can use these to say something a little bit more about sea level and where we might be headed in the future. And then the last thing, we provide detailed storylines and context for each of our 5 scenarios. What does the future look like under the high scenario, for instance, and which scenario is most likely? Really trying to help people understand these are the different possibilities for future sea level on the coastlines of California. And one thing to note here that the changes are meaningful since the 2017 Rising Seas report, and they are dictated by the latest science. So following along with the understanding of how the different processes contributing to sea level will evolve in the future, we are updating the science here for California. All right. So there's 5 sea level scenarios that we present, and these go from the low scenario to the high scenario. I'm presenting them here in terms of meters because that's kind of the round numbers in which they were defined in the federal report. The rest of this presentation, I'll talk about feet. But the low scenario is 30 centimeters of sea level rise by 2100, and the high scenario is 2 meters of sea level rise by 2100. And we're spanning the range in between with these other 3 scenarios. So just to talk through these briefly, the low scenario is really the assumption that the current rate of sea level rise will continue on into the future. So we're not going to see an acceleration in sea level rise. We'll have the lowest possible emissions and a very low warming future. So it's really the best case scenario that we could hope for. And then from there, we start to span a more likely range. So the intermediate low, about 50 centimeters of sea level rise by 2100, constrains a range of warming levels still relatively low and low emissions in the future. And it provides a reasonable bound of what we're calling the most likely amount of sea level rise in 2100. The intermediate scenario, again, covers a range of possible pathways. It could include the contribution from uncertain rapid ice sheet loss. I'll talk more about that in just a minute. But it also provides a reasonable upper bound of the most likely sea level rise in 2100. So between 50 centimeters and 1 meter really constrains our most likely range for where sea level rise in California is headed. As we start to move to the intermediate high and high scenarios, that's really where we start to have very high warming and very high emissions futures, coupled with the potential for rapid ice sheet loss. So this is when things are really going crazy down in the Antarctic ice sheet, really contributing dramatically to sea level rise. And the high end should really be considered an extreme case of possible sea level rise, only occurring in the event that the ice sheets are losing a lot of their mass very, very quickly. So one important note as I move forward, we talk about 2 different types of confidence in the report. And I don't want to get too down into the weeds here, but they're important to understand because these are conveyed in the IPCC. So we have something called medium confidence. And this level of confidence is meant to denote areas where there is agreement across a broad number of experts and models, such that we can say something like consensus about our understanding of future sea level rise. The low confidence scenarios denote disagreement between scientists and models about how sea level will continue to progress in the future. And we have limited evidence from observations and models to support those low confidence scenarios. So one example of what we're calling low confidence in this report and what the IPCC calls low confidence is in the potential for rapid ice sheet loss. So we need to really understand the difference between medium confidence, which represents more scientific consensus, and the low confidence, which is where there's still more scientific disagreement about how things might proceed. All right, so to show these in a little bit more detail, this is what the scenarios look like here on the right, the low through high scenario. It's important to note that the low to intermediate scenario span the range of possibilities without rapid ice sheet loss. So we can call these medium confidence, or the scenarios that scientists are most confident in. This is the range from 1 to 3.1 feet in 2100. The intermediate to high then span the range of possibilities where these low confidence or rapid ice sheet processes come into play, where we have less consensus among scientists and a little more disagreement. So this is a range between 3.1 to 6.6 feet of sea level rise by 2100. An important thing to note here on the right is that dashed line is the H++ scenario from the 2017-2018 report. And you can see that that high-end scenario from the previous report was well above the high scenario at all times within the current update. So this scenario is considered unrealistic based on the updated understanding of science, and that high-end number, our highest estimate, has come down significantly since then. One other note here, vertical land motion or uplift or subsidence we see along the coastlines is really the primary driver of local variations in sea level rise across the state. So the other causes of sea level rise, like ice melt and ocean warming, are fairly consistent along the coastlines of the United States. And the differences we may see along the coastline are really driven by subsidence or uplift. This is just to show some numbers here. So we do have numbers going all the way out to 2150. And to note that as you go out to 2150, the range really expands dramatically from 1.3 on the low side to 11.9 feet on the high side. And then we can also track the rates at which sea level will increase under these different scenarios. So almost a order of magnitude higher amounts of sea level rise at the high scenarios, and then doubling or tripling what we see now in those intermediate scenarios. One thing that we do in this report is a focus on the near term, so an increased focus on what's going to happen between now and 2050. Because of the updated science, the range in 2050 across the scenarios, so the plausible amount of sea level rise in 2050 is much narrower than in past reports, and actually just spans a difference of 8 inches between the low and the high scenarios. The observations that we have here in California are consistent with the intermediate scenario, so tracking very similar to the intermediate scenario. That's that black line or the red line that you see there intersecting with the intermediate scenario. And as a result, we call the intermediate the most likely amount of sea level rise in 2050, essentially collapsing down the expected sea level rise to a single scenario in 2050 with a small range about it. So again, this is increased confidence that scientists have in what's going to happen in the next 3 decades. Okay, so one more slide here before I get to the key takeaways and just summarize what's in this section 2. I know there's a lot going on with this table, but it's a very important one in terms of how we interpret the sea level scenarios. So these show the probabilities of exceeding different amounts or different scenarios of sea level and different warming futures. So along the top there, that's the amount of warming we might see in 2100, going from 1.5 degrees C to 5 degrees C. And the numbers below are the likelihood of passing the different scenarios in those futures. An important thing to note that the current trajectory for warming is 3 degrees C in 2100. So if we look at that middle column there, you can start to get an idea of what we could consider the most likely amount of sea level rise based on the current trajectory of warming. So we can add additional weight to what we might be expecting in terms of warming. So related to that, so based on warming and sea level trajectories, plus the medium confidence among scientists, going back to those medium confidence scenarios, leaving out those last 2 columns with the rapid ice sheet loss processes, sea level rise in 2100 will most likely be between the intermediate low and intermediate scenarios. So you can see here in a 3 degrees future, we have an 82% chance of exceeding intermediate low, but only a 5% chance of exceeding intermediate. Again, noting that this spans the range of what is most likely to occur. Without rapid ice sheet loss, the chances of reaching 6.6 feet or the high scenario by 2100 is effectively 0 at warming levels below 5 degrees Celsius. So reaching those higher end numbers are really only plausible or possible with the inclusion of rapid ice sheet loss. And this is just one final note. There is no scientific consensus currently on the rapid ice sheet loss processes. That is why the AR6 called them low confidence. So it's important to consider when interpreting the scenarios. All right, so just to finish up here, the key takeaways there, as I said, there is greater certainty and a narrowing range of sea level rise in the next 30 years. Statewide, we expect sea levels to rise about 0.8 feet or close to a foot by 2050, noting that you might see a little bit of difference from location to location driven by uplift or subsidence that may be occurring locally. By 2100, it is most likely sea levels in California will rise between 1.6 and 3.1 feet. Although certainly higher amounts cannot be ruled out depending on some of these uncertain sea level processes. Beyond 2100, the range really starts to expand. The possibility of rapid ice sheet loss starts to increase if warming were to continue to increase. And then by 2150, sea levels may rise between 2.6 and 11.9 feet between intermediate, low, and high scenarios. Ruling out the low scenario in this case because we're really just not tracking low scenarios, and based on current policy, it's not really on the table for us to achieve. Another key note here, the extreme sea level rise scenario, or H++ from the 2017 report, is much higher than the best available science suggests. Our high-end number has come down as a result from almost 10 feet down to about 6.6 feet. And even that 6.6 feet number should be considered in the context of those low confidence processes that are really key to forming that scenario. And then the last piece here is vertical land motion is the primary driver of local variations. We do provide a detailed discussion of vertical land motion within the report and how it can be considered alongside the scenarios. All right, with that, I will wrap it up, and I'm going to hand it over to Patrick Bernard at USGS, who's going to cover some of the information in section 4 of the report. Patrick, over to you.
Thanks, Ben. Okay, there I can share. Okay, I think everyone can see that now. So thanks so much. Yeah, I worked on chapter 4 with Gary Griggs and the rest of the Sea Level Rise Science Task Force to then look at the impacts of sea level rise on other coastal hazards. And so essentially what we're trying to do is answer that so what question. You know, now we have these higher sea level projections throughout the 21st century. What does that actually mean? How do we translate these projections into coastal hazards and societal exposure? And we spent a bit of time in the chapter highlighting the importance of storms right on top of sea level rise. And just to go back here to this first slide, just to kind of remind ourselves that we're seeing these ramifications today. You know, the last couple of winters, we've had some very large storms, of which the impacts were exacerbated by the 8 to 10 inches of sea level rise that California coast has experienced over the last century. So the first key takeaway here is that, you know, rising sea levels are going to exacerbate coastal flooding, erosion, and groundwater rise, and this can manifest itself in a number of different ways. You know, first of all, just simple high tide flooding, king tides. You know, we're seeing that increase in frequency and magnitude, but also higher water levels during storms. So whether they're, you know, sort of typical winter storms or storms influenced by high tides or storms influenced by El Nino winters, you know, we're seeing those across the state already, and those are going to simply increase as we go forward. Going to exacerbate, you know, beach erosion, cliff failures, and there's obviously been evidence of that throughout the state in the recent decades, and then the long-term rise of the coastal water table. So seeing groundwater rise, you know, we're seeing some of these issues in low-lying areas today, and that's going to increase in the future. And so areas that are having, you know, coastal hazard issues now are going to get worse, and some areas which have not experienced these issues are going to start to experience them as we move forward under these various sea level rise scenarios. So another key takeaway then is that sea level rise is going to increase the frequency of coastal flooding events, and there's a really nice example in the chapter of some work on this that Phil Thompson led in collaboration with NASA, and this is the tool they developed, which looks at the increase in flooding days over the next century. And by looking at a couple of predefined flooding thresholds that NOAA has established, minor, moderate, and major, which was also laid out in the Sea Level Rise Interagency Report at the federal level. And so what this shows here is increase in flooding days. This is an example from Alameda, but this is available for all the tide gauges across California. And what you see is basically an increase in the frequency of high tide flooding events beginning in about the 2030s. There's some suppression over the next decade due to the 18.6-year tidal nodal cycle, but then it really takes off. You see an exponential increase in flooding days, and the rule of thumb for California is that flood frequency effectively doubles with about every 2 to 4 inches of sea level rise. So with about a foot projected by 2050, that means at minimum an 8-fold increase in the number of flooding days for a given location. This varies a bit across the state based on all the different factors that Ben talked about for local relative sea level rise, but you see a rapid increase in those flooding days regardless. And so then the next key takeaway here is that sea level rise is going to impact public infrastructure, private development, livelihoods, health and safety, and natural systems. And here we basically mine the Cosmos projections for the state to look, in this case, at the exposure of the California coastal population to sea level rise and storms over the next century. And so when you look at these different blocks here, this is effectively the 2050 projection. And then these are all the other different sea level rise scenarios going from the low to the high scenarios here at 200 centimeters. And then the colors represent different storm levels. So the blue here is no storm up to a purple 100-year event. And so what you can see as we move through the century or through these different sea level rise scenarios is that the exposure to flooding increases dramatically. Just between the low and the high end scenarios varies by about a factor of 12. And then if you look from just the everyday flooding scenario to the extreme flooding scenario during storms, which incorporates storm surge, wave-driven processes, riverine processes, you can increase flood exposure up to about 4 times. So really important that we incorporate sea level rise and storms together as we plan moving forward. Next takeaway is we looked at how sea level rise will increase the rates of retreat of coastal cliffs and erosion of beaches, and also the loss of coastal wetlands, marshes, and dunes. And this is some work that Sean Batusik did across the state, which showed that roughly about 2/3 of the beaches and cliffs are going to erode at minimum of about 30 feet, and some of them much, much higher. And what this effectively means is that because we've built up our infrastructure across the state, we can lose roughly 50% of our sandy beaches as they're going to be essentially drowned between rising seas and backing infrastructure like seawalls and roads and things like that. The cliffs under the intermediate scenario are expected to retreat about 75 feet or so. So that's going to be a constant issue as well. But just all of this sort of underpins this issue that habitat space is going to be progressively limited between sea level rise and urban development. This is just an example, which is a really typical one across especially Southern California and some parts of the Central Coast and within the Bay Area too, is this coastal squeeze issue. And that is we have these natural, semi-natural systems, tidal wetlands and beaches, and all these ecosystems have the ability to migrate with sea level rise and have done so for thousands of years. But because we've built up our infrastructure with roads and railroads and commercial development, we've essentially pinned in these ecosystems and they have nowhere to go. And so a lot of them are going to be drowned as we move forward. And we have to really think holistically about how we're going to adapt to climate change in these environments to protect these areas. Next takeaway was that the groundwater table is going to rise as sea level rises, and this is an issue that hasn't seen a lot of attention until very, very recently. And effectively, what you have here is the water table is very shallow along the coast because it's basically pinned to sea level rise. But as we move forward in time and that sea level rises, that water table is going to rise as well. And in some cases, there's going to be saltwater intrusion, which will cause an issue. In some cases, there'll be ponding, which will cause an issue. In some cases, just having a shallow water table is going to cause lots of issues. And there's a couple of nice resources available. One was developed by Christina Hill and team. And this went through SFEI to look at sort of the extreme coastal water table levels and how that will change with sea level rise. And then statewide, the USGS developed an approach to look at how the median position of the water table would rise with sea level. And so these are interactive tools that can be used to dig into this problem a bit more. But we learned as we sort of summarize the information available across the state, there's all these potential issues with the rising water table. We can basically undermine foundations of roads and structures. We can damage utilities. We can liberate pollutants. We looked at this just for an example for the intermediate scenario across the state. What we found is that the shallow water table and emerging water table, the groundwater hazards could affect about 2 million residents and $500 billion in property and roads and critical facilities, et cetera, et cetera. And this ended up being as much as an order of magnitude higher than overland flooding. So not to say that the impacts are comparable, but the exposure is certainly on par with overland flooding. And so it's certainly a coastal hazard issue that has to be attended to as we think about how we're going to adapt to climate change. And then lastly, storms are going to increase the severity of coastal hazard impacts and flooding across the state. And this is just an example from the Sunset Beach area showing the present day situation. And then looking at the annual storm, we know there's high tide flooding in this location. This is very common with all these reclaimed estuaries across the state. And if you just look at that same annual storm with no change in the severity of that annual storm through time, that flooding is just going to get worse and worse as sea level rise goes up as we raise basically the benchmark for the elevation of the water along the coast. And so no change in storm magnitude assumed here, but you can see that the flood impacts get much, much worse as we move forward due to sea level rise alone. So lastly, just leave you a few links here for some other resources and hope you can check some of those out. And with that, I'll turn over to Justine Kimball from the Ocean Protection Council. She's the Senior Climate Change Program Manager, and she's going to talk about policy recommendations in the report.
Thank you, Patrick. I am relying on Dom to share my slides here today. Great. Thank you, Dom. And big thanks to Ben and Patrick for that great overview of the science chapters of the guidance. I will be presenting on the policy portion contained in chapter 3. The intent of the policy guidance is to support selection of sea level rise values for application in project and planning. Next slide. Similar to the 2018 guidance, we provide a stepwise process, and I'm actually going to take the time here to walk through each step. Next slide. Step 1 and 2 are pretty straightforward. For most efforts, you'll want to identify the closest tide gauge and use the table that corresponds to that. That is in the appendix of the report, 13 different tide gauge tables of the sea level rise scenarios. In some select instances, you might want to use the statewide table and calculate your own with local vertical land motion values, but for most projects, you'll be looking at the tide gauge values. And then step 2 is to identify the time horizon of your project or planning effort. How long is it anticipated to last? Realistically, most of the plans and projects that would be using this guidance would ideally persist beyond 2100 to 2100 or beyond, or that's our assumption. However, there can be, of course, be a shorter term or low consequence projects that might have shorter term actions or time horizons, or a series of steps leading to longer term goals. So really the intent of step 2 is to identify the appropriate time horizon for the planning or project effort. Next slide. And so once you've identified the location and lifetime of the project, our recommendation in the policy guidance is to use the intermediate high, and high scenarios with consideration of a 100-year storm to assess a spectrum of potential impacts, consequences, and responses. And then those corresponding values in your table that you'd be using would be the inputs into the vulnerability assessment. And then step 4 is to conduct a vulnerability assessment. This includes exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. We provide recommended considerations to include and to evaluate as part of the exposure and sensitivity and adaptive capacity, as well as some methodology options to use a sea level rise online tool, such as Our Coast, Our Future, seen here, or to do a tailor-made vulnerability assessment. And then existing vulnerability assessments should be used to the maximum extent possible. We are not trying to create additional work or to redo things and stay in a sort of never-ending planning cycle. So in most cases, we think that existing vulnerability assessments can and should be used, and it will likely just involve a crosswalk of the new numbers and the time horizons for expected impacts and potentially, projects to be shifted as appropriate. Next slide. And then step 5 in the process is new. We try to mirror this guidance as much as possible with real world situations. And we recognize that there was an important step between the conducting a vulnerability assessment and selection of those final sea level rise values, which is to explore adaptation options and feasibility of those options. So that's been added as step 5. And then step 6 is the selection of sea level rise values for a project or planning application. We again frame this selection by risk assessment, specifically risk aversion, which is defined as the strong inclination to avoid taking risks in the face of uncertainty. And so for low risk averse applications, we define those as adaptive, lower consequence situations that are fairly risk tolerant, for instance, a public bench or an unpaved coastal trail. Additionally, low risk should be considered for managing or restoring natural infrastructure, such as tidal wetland management and restoration. When an action has the capacity to be adapted into the future, it can be appropriate to apply the most likely sea level rise scenario rather than sort of a maximum worst case sea level rise scenario. And so that's the intent of this approach here with the low risk aversion. And then that intermediate scenario, as you saw from Ben's probability tables, represents that higher end of the likely range in 2100. And so it's recommended for this category of risk assessment. Versus the medium high risk averse applications are appropriate for less adaptive, more vulnerable projects that will experience medium to high consequences if impacted because of underestimating sea level rise. And so these efforts should be more resilient to higher end, less likely sea level rise scenarios, and therefore the intermediate high scenario is recommended for this type of project. And then finally, for extreme risk aversion, this is appropriate for those really high consequence projects that have little to no adaptive capacity that would be irreversibly destroyed or significantly costly to relocate or repair, or would have considerable public health, public safety, or environmental impacts. For instance, critical infrastructure should be considered an extremely risk-averse application. And so for these sort of applications, they should be resilient to the very high-end sea level rise scenarios when feasible, those sort of worst-case scenarios. And so therefore, the high scenario is recommended in those instances. And then storm conditions for extreme water levels should be considered and added as appropriate because the sea level rise scenarios do not include episodic events such as El Nino or storm conditions or tidal fluctuations. And so this is the general guidance, the risk assessment framework. We only give a few examples, and we realize it's sort of a big jump from the medium high to extreme risk examples. We aren't planning to get, really highly prescriptive in this section. We really defer to our colleagues at the Coastal Commission and BCDC in providing specific examples in relation to coastal development. And but we really wanted to frame frame out the risk assessment approach here with these recommendations. And then I wanted to provide tables here that compare the 2018 and the 2024 numbers from that risk framing perspective. Because the methodology changed from 2018 to this guidance, it's impossible to compare apples to apples. But from a policy perspective, you can compare how the numbers are being applied. And so there is a shift in the numbers here that people need to be aware of. But again, we're expecting that in most situations, you can do a crosswalk. And just shift time horizons as needed. And then to address some of the questions in the chat that I saw on this, we do think this is very consistent. The approach is essentially the same as the 2018, where we are using low risk to look at the high end of the likely range. In 2018, where we're looking at the high end of the likely range here, using the intermediate scenario as well. And then the medium high risk using the 1 in 200 versus the intermediate high. And then the H++ was recommended for extreme risk aversion. That was a very speculative high end worst case scenario projections in the 2018 guidance. And we're suggesting the high scenario in this iteration. And so we think there's a lot of consistency in the way that we have matched the risk categories with the scenarios here. And so that would be sort of the answer to some of those questions in the chat, but happy to expand on that further. Next slide. And then another aspect of step 6 that's new, and then I wanted to highlight, is that we wanted to recognize that particularly at the project level, selection of sea level rise is often a multi-factor process. And I have a quick example of that here. These are photos from the Cardiff State Beach Living Shoreline Project in Encinitas. The photos on the left, the A, are before, and the photos on the right, the B, are the after photos. This was the first of its kind, a prototype using a project using a living dune with engineered components for protection of hard infrastructure, specifically Highway 101. This project was many years in the making, and then when it came time to do the actual design and construction, sea level rise was obviously a very critical consideration in this project, but it was also one of many factors, including visual impacts, the adjacent freeway, Highway 101, engineering feasibility, and then that all factored into the final design decision. And in the end, selection of those design specification was a negotiation and a compromise of trade-offs with all the project partners, including Coastal Commission. So the last step really tries to reflect these real-world situations. Next slide. And so that's the summary of the policy guidance. I wanted to end with highlighting that the state has prioritized and continues to prioritize funding for coastal resilience. This includes the recently released SB1 Sea Level Rise Adaptation Grant Program to support the development of local and regional sea level rise adaptation plans and projects, with $71.4 million available for funding, which is part of the overarching $660 million maintained in the FY 24-25 budget for critical coastal resilience programs and projects. And then OPC continues to convene the State Regional Sea Level Rise Collaborative to coordinate and implement efforts on coastal resilience. Next slide. And then just to close, just to highlight again, you can find all the information to register and on the guidance at the website listed there. We are currently within the public comment period. We have a series of regional workshops that we are encouraging and hope for really good attendance. We want to really dig into particularly the application piece, hear from people on the ground, specific examples, and really open to making adjustments as makes sense. And then please send any questions to me and public comments to Ben Dorfman at OPC. Thank you, and I will pass it back to Dom, I believe.
Thanks, Justine. And also thanks to Ben and Patrick for also providing great presentations on the different components of the guidance. So if I could take a moment and ask all of our panelists to turn their video back on, we'll now jump into a Q&A panel discussion to answer some of the questions from the webinar participants. And a friendly reminder to please submit those questions through the Q&A features, and we can start addressing questions that way. But while we wait for those questions to stream in, I wanted to take a moment first to welcome Dr. Christina Hill, who is from the University of Berkeley and is also on our task force, who's going to be joining us for this Q&A discussion. And Christina, I'm wondering if you want to lead us off in this discussion by first introducing yourself, but also providing us an explanation for why it might be important to consider or include information on inundation and flooding when we're discussing or planning for sea level rise.
So I'm a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, and I've been helping with the science side of the SLR task force. My area of expertise is really in what's happening with the groundwater and how that might affect contaminated sites. And I would just flag, in a sort of way of answering that question, Dom, that coastal strategies alone that don't consider rising groundwater aren't going to address the flooding problem. Long before that groundwater is emergent, it's going to have some of the impacts that Patrick Barnard talked about, where it could have an impact on building foundations, underground pipe systems, soil strength, lots of different issues that are going to come up as a result of higher groundwater. So on the contaminated site side, it's really a game of inches, not 4 to 6 feet. It's really about, is the contaminant going to be inundated that wasn't in the past? And that could be just a matter of half a foot or less. So I hope people will pay attention to that particular aspect of change that we're going to be seeing around the whole state.
Awesome. Thanks, Christina. So I'm going to jump us into our first question in the Q&A chat here. And this one says, in the executive summary, the intermediate low scenario provides a reasonable estimate of the lower bound for most likely sea level rise by 2100. And the intermediate scenario provides a reasonable upper bound for the most likely range of sea level rise by 2100. But then we go on to say evaluation of the intermediate high, and high scenarios is recommended to inform appropriate planning. Ooh, things are moving on me. Fortunately, I just lost that question. Here we go. To inform planning and project decisions. It seems like this report is giving 2 different recommendations for what to plan for. Can we explain this discrepancy? I'm wondering if Ben or Justine want to jump in on that question.
Yeah, I can see what I can. Yeah, it would be great if Ben could jump in too. I've been trying to understand the question, and I think maybe there's a when we're talking about the in the executive summary, the lower bound for the most likely sea level rise by 2100. That's from the science section, but when we're recommending evaluation of intermediate high to high, that's the policy section. So essentially we are not recommending use of the intermediate low scenario in evaluation of planning and projects. And so that's just the recommendation. It's again consistent with 2018, where we did not recommend the lower end of the likely range as part of application and use and planning and projects. So that is so I don't, yeah, it is not meant just saying that the intermediate low is the lower bound of the most likely sea level rise is not a recommendation. That is just stating the science versus the intermediate to high are the recommendation for use. And that is consistent with being very precautionary in planning and projects. And so we are recommending that high end of the likely range in 2100, the intermediate scenario, be the minimum even for low consequence projects. And that is the recommendation of the policy guidance. Ben, anything to add?
No, I think you covered it. I mean, the science update is really the evaluation of the most likely. So that's driven by scientific lines of evidence and is separate from the guidance that's in section 3. So Justine, I think you captured that well.
And we'll continue with this topic because we have a related question to that previous one.
Yeah.
And it's stating here, compounding the confusion is a stated bias in section 3 for using the high scenario where public health or safety is at risk. The likelihood of high happening by 2100 is close to 0. Why are we pushing people to use such an unlikely future scenario? And won't this risk driving people to high cost, risky maladaptation practice approaches?
The high scenario, from my understanding, in 2150 has a probability more like 4 to 10%. So it's not always effectively 0. It is close to 0 in 2100, but as we've stated, we think a lot of the policy and project decisions are likely to want to persist beyond 2100. So there is a 4 to 10% chance of the high scenario occurring at 2150. And as we stated, these are situations where we want to prepare for the absolute worst case scenario. And in the 2018 guidance, that was the H++ scenario, the very speculative with an unknown probability scenario. And that's what we recommended, to be extremely precautious in those situations that are really not adaptive and very high consequence. And so to be consistent with that 2018 guidance, we are recommending the high scenario for those applications. So that's essentially the answer. Ben, did I capture that correctly with the probability of the high in 2150?
Yeah, and I can actually give, related to that, give the answer to a couple other questions here, where it's a little bit of a when, not if framing. So yes, the H++ scenario is no longer considered plausible by 2100. That's really a result of the scientific understanding of those low confidence, those rapid ice sheet loss processes shifting so that you need more warming and thus more time to trigger them. So they're pushed further out into the future. So it is possible to get to that high scenario when that range really expands beyond 2100 up to 2150. So again, this is all kind of driven by the understanding of the ice sheets. I did see one other question about when the science might provide more clarity on the rate of ice sheet melting, hopefully as soon as possible. But all I can say is scientists are continuing to work on that. I mean, that is a key driver of the high-end estimates right now. And a lot of work is going into understanding those processes. But I do want to make clear they're fully accounted for within the report and the scenarios we have here, and really are driving that when, not if framing that Justine was talking about.
And Ben, I will actually go back to you. I think this next question is related to your explanation there. And it was, my understanding was that the low risk scenarios were based on governments demonstrating that CO2 emissions would be under control. Yet all data shows CO2 at all-time highs and only rising and breaking records. So how was the risk lowered from 2018 to 2024 and to not consider H++ for building projects?
Yeah, so just in terms of the actual numbers and the science, it really is just driven by those the ice sheets, and when we think those high-end contributions could be triggered, and it really is further into the future. We really do consider the full range of possibilities in terms of emissions, future emissions going forward, including the best case where the world kind of comes together and really drives to lower emissions in a way that maybe is not foreseeable right now. And then it also frames the worst case where things kind of spiral out of control. So we are including all those different possibilities as they were covered within the IPCC, and they're built into these scenarios.
All right, so we're going to pivot back to the planning side here. Our next question asks, can you give examples of low, medium, high, extreme risk aversion projects? Specifically, the examples between high and extreme risk aversion projects.
Yeah, I mentioned this in the slides. Yeah, we do make sort of a large jump between the high and the medium high and the extreme risk aversion. I think we'd like to build this area out more in the guidance, and we're going to work with our colleagues at Coastal Commission and BCDC to do that. We just want to make sure, we're all coordinated, and coastal development is just a highly coordinated effort. And so we look to, I think, build that out more. We just have the few examples in the current draft. And so, yeah, we'll look to that. But to say again, we don't see that section as being like highly prescriptive. It's not going to end up to be like, here are all the low risk examples, here are all the medium high. Like, it's not going to be super prescriptive with every single example, laid out, because there's no one size fits all approach to projects and planning. And so we plan to make that guidance still be more general and let the specifics sort of play out at the local project planning level.
And I see Patrick responding to a question in the Q&A chat that I was going to pivot to next. So this one can be posed to him. And Christina, if you want to chime in on this as well. But this question asked, how far inland would groundwaters be expected to rise to impact buildings, soils, or access potentially contaminated sites? Is there some kind of formula or dependent on a site-by-site basis?
I could take a quick crack at that and then turn it over to Christina. There really is no rule of thumb per se. It's highly dependent on the local geology, effectively the hydraulic conductivity of the soil and the sediment, whether it's very porous or not as porous, and there's also faulting and there's tectonic controls as well. So, but generally, it's particularly acute within 1 or 2 kilometers of the coast, I would say, but you can have a response to the water table, tens of kilometers inland, just highly dependent. And that's why really we've tried to do, and Christina's group too, is look at well data and use numerical modeling so we can really determine how far inland that extent is and and basically how much that water table is going to respond to sea level rise, because it's so difficult to do that and just sort of back of the envelope or rule of thumb perspective.
Maybe I could add that if you're looking at it kind of in a map perspective, the flat river valleys are going to have a deeper inland impact than steeper slope areas. So that's where you might look for a planning impact. And then if pumping is occurring, we could see saline groundwater come up higher where pumping is occurring. So that's going to be a hot spot for problems with salinity.
All right, unless we have time for one last question. So we'll go with a question from Brad, which is, how do we zero in on the confidence levels and sea level rise estimates for more specific geography rather than from Marin to San Diego counties as in general?
I can take that one. Yeah, that's a good question. And it was a little bit glossed over in the presentation I gave here, but we are providing local information within the report. One thing to note is that the confidence levels we have in some of the processes that impact sea level in California, like the ice sheets and the thermal expansion or ocean expansion due to warming, are really driven by global scale processes. So when we talk about confidence levels, you can say something similar about locations along the California coastline, whether it be in San Diego or Marin. It's when you start talking about things like vertical land motion that the factors become much more localized. So I would say that that additional driver affects our confidence levels in the scenarios in specific locations. But we do also provide ranges at individual locations and then the scenarios at individual locations too. So it is localized, detailed information to the best that science supports at this point. And then obviously the work that about impacts needs to be very localized. So that's when it starts to become a different discussion. But at least on the sea level scenarios, we can provide that framing.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben. And I know that we didn't get to all the questions in the chat, but I hope folks found this Q&A discussion and the previous presentations useful. So with that, I will turn things over to Jen, who's going to close the meeting for us.
Thank you, Dom. I want to thank everyone who joined us today for this webinar, and specifically and particularly Patrick, Ben, Justine, Christina, and Dom, and everyone at the Ocean Science Trust team. Thank you so much for your commitment to this work and your expertise. We know we're seeing this week the impacts of climate on our coast are risking public health and safety, access, our natural habitats, public and private property. And this is a really important document to help ensure that California is prepared and can adapt into the future. So we are committed to doing that and making sure that we can withstand the impacts of climate change and continue to thrive into the future. So thank you all for helping us do that. We could not do it without all of you. We will be capturing the outstanding questions that we didn't have a time to answer in the meeting today, and we will be following up with a frequently asked questions sheet. So please stay tuned for that. We'll post that on OPC's website. We will have, just to reiterate, maybe, I don't know if we want to pop this slide back up. We will have 4 regional workshops coming up next week. So that's really, as Justine mentioned, an opportunity to really dig into those regionally specific questions and concerns. And we do very much appreciate all of the input as we move from this draft document to the final. We want it to be understandable and usable for the folks that are on the ground. So please join us for these workshops, submit your written comment, and thank you so much for your time. We'll see you all soon.